So that's Nigeria. Let's talk about another aspect of Nigeria, its political economy or its economy, which is quite similar to that of Mexico, but we see a difference in the story that gets told. We are talking about oil, right? And think back to the story of the resource curse and that of Golden Goose. And remember that all oil producing countries in the world had a fantastic time in the early 1970s because the price of oil went up due to the oil crisis and OPEC raising the oil prices. Everybody, whether they are part of OPEC or not, by the way, OPEC is a consortium of oil producing countries. Whether they are oil producers or not, the prices of oil had gone up so much that they were making lots of money. Of course, a lot of this money, uh, it being the 1970s, went up people's noses, but it did not allow uh, countries to invest more. We saw in the next Mexico's case, and Nigeria was no different. Suddenly, they were making a lot of uh, mm, more money, but they were also being loaned a lot of money by banks who said, "Oh wow, you guys have oil. That's great. We'll lend you anything you want." And Nigeria took this money and invested it in some good things sometimes too, right? Like education, defense, infrastructure. But again, probably try to reach for these things too quickly, borrowing too much money without actually having the means to pay for it. Saying we will, well, in the future, within the next 10 years, we will have the oil and oil production to pay back all these debts, we will be fine. What they ended up doing was also, remember, there being lack of capital there, the government really had to start a lot of businesses, which is what we call a parastatal. Para means partially. So the partially status, like partially owned by state. Private businesses, part private, part public. So banks, construction companies, manufacturing companies were partly owned by the state. But when you have that high level of control by the state, these businesses were rife with uh, rent seeking, and that became a huge problem. Sure, some businesses were started, but they were never businesses where Nigeria could export anything because they were so poorly run and non competitive. So, yeah, Nigeria was not producing very much. So, rather than actually exporting more, they were further going into debt and getting a large trade deficit because they were forced to import more, especially capital goods. The kind of things that allowed them to make other things which are very expensive, heavy machinery, things of that, and the government was not spending its revenue. Now, another aspect here was the kind of say, well, we are going to run everything through the state, right? Uh, Kind of like the Agriculture Marketing Board. Say we want the government to lead this effort and get in kind of more a socialistic logic behind it. But all this attempt at national economic planning really failed, partially due to the incompetence among leaders. Unlike US, where we had fantastic billionaires who could run all of our ministries because they are just in department because they are so brilliant. In Nigeria, you didn't have this. Instead, people got this position through nepotism, which never happens in US. Of course, um, nobody would get a position simply because they are son or son-in-law of well, usually you don't have that thing happening in the US. Um, Of course, now the current administration, people may raise question, but usually to a large extent, it doesn't happen in US. In Mexico, because of the way political parties were established, um, there was a lot of favoritism, and people got their position not because they knew anything about business, but because um, they know anything, because they were getting rewards, a little bit of paybacks, and a little bit of uh, uh, kickbacks. So it was very difficult to plan nationally your economic growth when the record keeping was so unreliable. Uh, because an awful lot of in Nigeria happens off the books, a lot, because an awful lot of money is being embezzled, and there is a lot of kickbacks and things of that nature. So you know that one side of that is that they have to hide these things. The other side is you don't really know how much people are producing and how much something really costs, because most of these numbers are lies. In the end, there is a very little discipline. The government is trying to lead right in one direction. We are going to invest in cars, or we are going to invest in buildings, hotels, things like that, right? You don't have businesses failing or falling, and there is a nice organization here that I have uh, got. And so this idea, so let's say the government says, mm, I want to give an example here. So let's say the government says that to one of these parastatal banks, when these banks um, that's partially owned by, where these banks are partially owned by the state, we seek to make our construction industries grow. So please reserve most of your money for people coming in with construction projects. So let's say the government states those things to banks. But instead, a peanut farmer shows up with a big envelope of money at that bank, and the bank director allows herself or himself to be bribed. And then, when you know, given the money to the peanut farmer so that he can invest more, then comes somebody from construction company saying, "We would like to borrow some money," and the bank director says, "Sorry, we don't have any more," right? And that completely destroys any plans of that business had before. So, unfortunately for Nigeria, the golden goose parable largely comes true, and there is a huge crisis. Um, and when oil prices drop, and what happens in the same case in Mexico, they are hugely in debt, and they say, "Well, how can we repay these debts?" And the next thing you see, the international banks say, "Well, we will loan you some more money, but you are going to have to change the way you do business. You are going to have to become more open to free trade, and you are going to have to institute something which the IMF calls Structural Adjustment Program, or also known as SAP. You're going to have to adjust the very structure of your economy, uh, from one where government has heavy control of businesses to where it's mostly more laissez-faire, which is more efficient. So the World Bank and IMF required that a lot of this parastatal, um, which were so inefficient or so corrupt, be privatized, that the government sell those to private individuals. Now, of course, there is a huge problem in a country which does not have a lot of wealthy people, but also a country where very few people are willing to invest in manufacturing industry, right? So you've got a very inefficient company that producing sewing machine. No one was going to buy that, right? They are going to say, "This is awful. We are not going to fire a bunch of workers. It's not an efficient business. So we are going to fire some bunch of workers. I don't want to buy it, right?" Due to all this instability and corruption, um, and the economic policy that shift from year to year, uh-uh, you know, even if you sell it cheap, I'm not buying it. That would be the attitude of an investor. So, while these SAP structural adjustment programs were designed to really hand over this government control of the economy, no one, not much of private sector has stepped up to invest, and they remain in the hands of government. Another aspect of what IMF and World Bank say is, okay, you're going to have to reduce your spending, right? You guys are spending a lot of money in anticipation of oil money. That's now no longer coming. Now you have to lower your expenditure. What we call this austerity. You know. The austerity is the idea that you spend less money, to be frugal, stay within your budget. Now, austerity is difficult when a government says, okay, we are all going to suffer now for a little bit, all right? I usually say, I don't want to suffer. I'm not going to vote you. If you make me suffer, I'm going to vote you out of office. But it is even worse when your government is one like what you got in Nigeria, that's already lacks in legitimacy to such a great degree. A popular government might be able to say that, um, right, and when President Obama was elected, we have to practice some austerity because of the recession that we had, or the President Obama inherited right from the previous administration through the mortgage crisis. But he was very popular leader, at least during the first term, and he had a lot of political capital, and people were prepared to sacrifice for goals that they believed in. Also, it's not his fault in the first place. On the other hand, in Nigeria, this that wasn't this case. Government in general was viewed having no legitimacy, and nobody was very happy about cuts. And for that reason, the government didn't make the kind of cuts that it should have, for the fear of being voted out of office, or if it's a military government, for the fear of calling for a return to democracy. So, unlike Mexico, which was had a lot of its debt forgiven, Nigeria has really struggled there because the government has not been able to control its spending in the same way that Mexico government was able to practice austerity. As a result, in Nigeria, there is not a lot of business outside oil, which is okay as long as oil prices hold, and it's kind of it has. There were some fairly high oil prices, and for much of the decade of 2000, partially due to all the wars in the Middle East, right? That helped Nigeria out, um, in terms of being able to pay off its debts, but really in terms of being a healthy economy, its diversification level remains very low. It's not like it has branched out of oil production into other kinds of industry. It's very much still myopically focused on that. And we all know what happens at the end of the story of a golden goose. Also, as a result of the lack of diversification, um, sorry, sorry about that. Um, as a result of this diversification, we see that, mm, or sorry, lack of diversification. You once again, sorry. Let me get that slide. Okay, sorry. So this lack of diversification, you have some wealth around the oil industry, but overall inequality is very high in Nigeria. Its Gini coefficient is like 43, little bit below the US, but still very inegalitarian society. That is very much geographically concentrated with the north. So, in closing, simply that's the situation of Nigeria, which again doing okay for one reason, but it's a huge economy, but it's far from being